Okay guys, so we talked earlier about how the fact that these are semi-floaters, what that means is the pin is actually larger than that pin bore. If you try to push that in there, you can't. Now when we get them apart, you saw we pressed them earlier, but you can't press these in. So what we do is we use a machine called a rod heater, and you can see that we have coils in there, and those coils get hot and they heat the rod up. Now there's a thermostat on this. You don't want to overheat the rod. You want to get it to the right temperature. We heat these to about 320 degrees, and the thermostat keeps the temperature even, because if you overheat the rod, like with a torch or something, you're gonna ruin it. You could actually cause the metal to fatigue and break in the motor, and that is no bueno. So we've got a piston stop here. We've got this set up, and what we do is we put the piston up here, and we set the stop up so that when we push that pin in, we go all the way up against the stop and it centers it. Now remember, the pistons and the rods are directional. The notch or the dot or the arrow on the piston goes to the front of the engine. So we've set this up so that when we heat this rod up, it'll be the correct orientation. If you look at this rod, there's a big chamfer on one side, on this side, and the other side doesn't have a chamfer like that. And also the beam of the rod is offset here. It's bigger on one side than it is the other. So we need to make sure this is right. This is this is our last rod. I've already done all six, all the other 7, and this is number 6. So the number 6 is going to go on the bank that has 5, 6, 7, 8, which is the left bank of the engine. So we orientated this so that this would be correct in there. 4 rods go on one way and the other bank is going to go the other way. So it's probably best that you let a machine shop or some professionals do this, because it is very possible you could screw this up if you don't do it right. Okay, so now we put our connecting rod in there and we make sure it's the right orientation, and then we let it heat up, and it's going to temporarily swell that rod, and once it's hot enough, then we just slide the pin in. All right, so we're going to take our rod and we are going to put it in the heater, and you see that our heater or thermostat kicked on, and we're going to let that heat up. I'll probably chop some of this out because it takes a good 4 or 5 minutes for that to heat up to temperature. Now I don't really know how to explain to you how I know when that's hot enough. I can literally tell by feeling the rod just from experience how warm it gets here when it's ready, and it is really cold right here now, so it's not ready yet. Now these pistons actually have the provision for a C-clip in here, and you can use a full floater. That means there's a bushing in the small end of the rod, and it comes with these clips here, and if you have a bronze bushing or a full floater, you have a C-clip that goes in the end of the piston here in that groove right there, and it holds the pin in. But since we're using semi-floaters for budget constraints, we're not going to be using the bushed rods with the C-clips. All right, so yes, definitely hot enough. Now you always want to put some oil on this. I always want to make sure we got oil on this pan. Don't put this in dry. And now we just take our connecting rod and we simply slide the pin in against the stop, and you see how that just slid in there? Now this will be tight until the heat transfers. Right now the rod won't move, and there it goes. It loosened up. And that is your semi-floating connecting rod, and that's how you do it. And now we can walk through assembling the short block of the engine. I'm getting excited about this thing. By the way, we are going to put the car on the chassis dyno once we get this thing done and see how much power we make with these GT40 heads. Should be pretty cool. All right guys, so now we've got all the piston and rod assemblies assembled, and we are ready to go over and put the short block together in the block shop. All right, so we're back over here in the block shop. One thing that I would remind you of, make sure you get these plugs in, the 3 gallery plugs in the back, and always use a little bit of Loctite on these threads, and I even put a little dab of it on the outer rim of that core plug, that rear cam plug, so it doesn't leak. You don't need a ton of it, but these will seep oil if you don't seal them. I want to make sure I got those in because I'm going to go ahead, now that I've got an engine stand freed up because the 383 is gone, I sold it yesterday, I am going to put this up on the engine stand, and then we'll get the pistons and rods assemblies because it's easier to maneuver on the stand. hand. Another thing I would encourage you here, guys, on the back of the block on the top, there is a core plug that goes in here. It blocks off the oil gallery. Now, we removed the old one before the vatting process. Don't forget to put that back in, otherwise you're going to have oil shooting out of there. All right, now for engine assembly, there's a few important things that we got to check here. So since this bore is 30 over, you can see it says 30 over on the piston here. We're going to use our 4 to 5 mic on this. So what you want to do is you want to measure the pistons. Now, Sealed Power has done us a real favor here. There's actually a requirement for how far below the top of the skirt that you measure this. But if you look on Sealed Power pistons and you actually measure that blank spot right there where they have left the coating off, that is where they require you to measure the skirt. So we're just going to take our micrometer and we're going to get right on that spot there, and we're going to measure the skirt on that area right there. We're going to get in the center, we're going to get a reading here. We want to make sure that our clearance, our piston to cylinder wall clearance, is correct. I actually already know that it is because I've already measured all these, but I just want to demo this for you. So there's our reading right there. And our micrometer is reading 28.5. So 4.0285. That's about a thou and a half smaller than the 30 over, which is what the bore should be. All right, now that we have established the size of our piston here, we're going to take our dial bore gauge here, we're going to calibrate it. We're going to see the fingers of the bore gauge in between the mic here, and we're going to calibrate it. So we just take our micrometer here, I put it in between the fingers of that dial bore gauge right there. Now I am duplicating the size of my piston. We'll get that on here, and now on the other end I just zero out my dial bore gauge right there. Now my dial bore gauge is on 0, corresponding with the size of my piston, and then I take my bore gauge and I stick it in the bore. I got that dialed center there, and you can see I am 0 there is my piston size, and I'm reading about 2 to 2.5 thousandths clearance, which is exactly what we want for that clearance. 2 to 2.5 is where we should be for a cast hyper-eutectic piston, so we're looking good. Now, again, I've already gone through and checked all these, and we're 2 to 2.5 on every cylinder, so our clearances are good, but you don't want to skip this. This is something you want to make sure you do. Another thing is your ring end gap. All right, so let's take a look at our rings here. Now, we have a top compression ring and a second. If you have moly-coated or molybdenum-coated rings, guys, they're really easy to tell apart. If you look at the darker gray on this ring, that's the second ring, and if you look at the top ring, you see how shiny and it's kind of a lighter silver color? That is the moly-coated ring, so the dark is the second, the shiny one is the top. They also have bevels in certain spots. The second ring in this set also has a dot on it. I hope you can see that there, but the dot or the word top always goes up. Now we need to check the end gaps on both of these rings here with the ring installed in the bore. Now the ring has to be square, so what I will do is I'll just put the ring in the bore and bring it up toward the top, and I'll use the piston. I went ahead and I put the oil ring on one of the pistons, and I'm just going to use that piston to square up that ring. I'm going to push it in. The oil ring is going to catch the block right there. So what that's doing is the ring is sitting square now in the bore, and we can measure that gap. All right, now this is critical. For the gap on that ring, this is a 4-inch bore, we want a minimum of 4 thousandths gap per inch of bore. If you're running nitrous or forced induction or something, you want that gap bigger, because if that gap closes up and gets tight, it's going to blow the engine. But for a stock naturally aspirated engine like this, or mildly modified naturally aspirated engine, 4 thousandths per inch of bore is perfectly acceptable. So we're going to take our calculator here. We have a 4.030 bore, 30 over, and we're going to multiply that times 0.004, and we get a minimum now of 16 thousandths. It's actually a little bigger than 16, so we say 17. We want a minimum of 17 thousandths gap. It's okay if the gap is a couple thousandths bigger than that, 18, 19, whatever. It is not okay at all if it is smaller than that, because the ends are going to butt up against each other, and trust me, you will have a catastrophic failure. it will literally blow your engine into a million pieces. And then of course you have a connecting rod flopping around in your bore. So this is a big deal. You got to make sure that you check this. So we're going to take our handy dandy feeler gauge set here, and we're going to start with 17 because that's our minimum. We don't want it any smaller than that, so we'll just go ahead and start with that. That is 17 thousandths right there. Okay, so I have zeroed in on that gap, and we're going to take our gauge and we're going to make sure that it goes in there. 17 is going in there with no problem. Okay, so we're good. And a lot of times on a bore like this, especially with good rings out of the box, the end gap is usually really good. Usually don't have any problem. Now if it gets bigger, I've got some other videos where I'm actually file fitting the rings. I'm gonna go with a 19 here and see what I get. The 19 goes in about halfway and gets snug and stops. So I'm gonna say 18. Let's back it off to 18 and see what we get. Yeah, 18's going in. So 18 goes, 19 partially goes, and I bet if we put 20 it wouldn't even go in at all. So that is a really good end gap. Like I said, a little extra end gap is infinitely better than not enough. If these things are tight, man, have a machine shop file them or something. If you're running boost, take the piston manufacturer recommendations and ring manufacturer recommendations on how much gap you should have for X amount of boost. Really, really critical, because this will take your motor out. A lot of times guys will take turbos and stick them on a stock Honda or whatever, and they boost them and they end up blowing the engine up because it has the stock ring end gap, and they're like, oh, turbos blow motors, or they put nitrous on it and they blow it up. When in reality, if they had just taken the engine apart and file fit the rings to the correct gap, the thing probably would have lived for a long time. So that's actually one of the two number one things that kill forced induction motors is, number one, a lean air fuel. They don't have enough fuel for the boost they put in, and clearances are too tight and things just break and blow up, and they want to blame the turbo or the nitrous, when most of the time it's not the turbo or the nitrous, it's the guy that set up the turbo or the nitrous who didn't clearance the motor correctly. So I'm just throwing it out there for you. All right, so I've already checked all the gaps on these. I'm not going to do every one on camera because you guys would, you'd fall into deep depression or something having to watch that. So very important though, make sure that whatever piston is going in that particular bore, you check the rings that are going to go on that piston in that same bore. Keep the rings with their respective cylinders and pistons. That's important. And of course, ours are all numbered. This is number 5 here. So let's say this was number 5 cylinder. It's not, but let's just say hypothetically it was. The rings that we checked in the number 5 cylinder are going to go on the number 5 piston, and that whole assembly goes in that bore. So hopefully that makes sense. The next thing you want to do, this is actually the number 7 cylinder. So I'm going to get the number 7 piston, and I want to talk to you about putting the rings on. So you want to put the expander and the 2 scraper rails on for your oil ring, and make sure that that expander is butted up on the ends and not overlapped. Now the next thing is we want to look at this is our number, this is our 2nd ring. It is really important, you guys, that you use ring and expander pliers. I actually had somebody comment on one of my videos recently, I think it was just yesterday, and he talked about how that he worked in a shop and he broke a really expensive ring putting it on a piston, and then his boss took the ring pliers and he broke another ring putting it on a piston. He said, my boss took the ring pliers and threw them in the garbage, and we've been rolling the rings on ever since. Okay, so no piston manufacturer in the world, you guys, recommends that you twist this ring and roll it on that piston. In fact, they all tell you not to do that, because if it's a cast or a steel ring, it damages the ring. If you're breaking these things using ring pliers, the problem is not the tool. The tool doesn't need to be thrown away. The guy putting the rings on needs to have somebody more experienced put the rings on, or practice or something. These are not the problem, okay? I'm just gonna throw that out there for you, because I've heard this from multiple people. Those things are garbage, I broke rings. Yeah, just because you break something using a specific tool, that doesn't mean the tool's bad. It's usually the skill level of the guy using the tool that needs work. I'm just being real with you, okay? I've been using ring pliers to put rings on for 25 years. You know how many rings I've broken? 0. Not 1. and we're talking thousands of motors. So I'm not buying that nonsense that the tool should not be used. The manufacturers tell you to. I'm going to do what the guys who engineered the ring say. Now, the dot on the ring, this is my second ring. Remember, that dot is going to go up. Now let me show you how to use these ring pliers. Take the ring, put the ring on top of the piston and put your thumb on it like that. Get your ring pliers on the end. Once you get the ring pliers on the end, push that ring up against the piston. Just like that. Just push it up against the piston so it's not going to come out of there. And then we're just going to expand that ring enough to get it over the piston. If I were to reef these pliers open as hard as I can, of course I'm going to break the ring, right? So it's not the tool, trust me. And the order of piston installation is your oil ring first, your second, and your top, because you don't want to stretch the upper rings over the bottom one. Now we go to our Molly top ring. Now on this particular ring, there's no dot on it, but if the top ring does have a bevel on the inside here, guys, that needs to face up. The bevel on the second ring faces down, and the bevel on the top ring, this inner bevel here, and this really doesn't even have one, it's actually pretty square. But if it does have a bevel, I'm going to put that bevel up. This has a bevel, but it's exactly the same on both sides. So realistically, this ring would go on either way. The bevel is the same. There's literally no difference. And that's true of a lot of top rings. They'll go on either way, but the second ring is definitely directional almost always. So again, take your ring, get it in your expander pliers, push it up against the side of the piston and expand that thing. It doesn't take much. Just barely expand it and put it on. Simple. Now that we've got that, we've also got our bearings in here. Another thing we need to check, and of course I've already done it off camera, but I want to explain it to you, is we want to take and we want to torque this cap on before we actually put the connecting rod in, and we want to check our clearances. Okay, we're going to mic our connecting rod journal. We're going to torque this up, and we're going to measure the journal with a mic, and then we're going to set our bore gauge for this and check our clearances. I'm actually not going to do that on camera for this engine, for the mains or the rods, because I mean, I have done that in so many videos. I've already done all the clearances in this. If you want to see the procedure for checking main bearing clearance and rod clearance, and I actually, in my other 289 video from 4 years ago, I did that. You can go back and watch that. I have a ton of videos. If you want to see that process, let me know in the comments, and I will post a link to a video where you can see a detailed description of how to check these clearances. It's the same on every engine. So I'm not gonna put that in the video. It's just redundancy. So, all right, so make sure your clearances are right, and now we are ready to assemble our short block. Now on your cylinder, make dang sure that you take WD-40 and you wipe these bores out thoroughly until you get nothing but clean WD-40 on your towels. We've already wiped all these out and cleaned them. Now this is in addition to final washing with soap. This is your last step before you actually put this piston in there. You want to make sure that that cylinder is spotlessly clean. Take the piston, spray WD-40 on the skirts and on the ring. Now I know I'm going to draw the ire of some people by doing this with the WD-40. Call Total Seal Piston Rings in Phoenix, Arizona and ask them what they recommend putting on the skirts and the rings. And I'm telling you right now, they're going to tell you to put WD-40 on them. The problem with putting a thick assembly lube, I see guys goop these in oil. That is the worst thing you can do with a piston. And I'll tell you why. This is worth mentioning here. What happens is if you get a thick gob of oil on this ring, or even especially assembly lube, that's the worst possible thing. What happens when you fire the engine up, if there's a thick lube between the ring and the piston, the ring cannot cut through that lube fast enough to seat against the bore, and what happens is when the cylinder fires, that assembly lube or that thick oil, I've seen guys use like 2050 and goop the piston in it. Terrible idea. What happens is the ring cannot cut through that assembly lube. When the cylinder, it bakes that assembly lube, it superheats it and burns it, and it creates a coating between the cylinder and the ring, and it can actually glaze your cylinder wall within a few seconds of you starting the engine. I've seen it happen. So glazing the cylinder wall is not good. It wipes that crosshatch off of there, and the crosshatch is necessary for seating the rings properly and lubricating the rings. So thin coating of WD-40. The first couple of seconds you start this thing up, there's going to be tons of oil thrown up on the cylinder wall. All you need is just a thin coating of, you can use light engine oil, or I like WD-40 because that's what Total Seal recommends. I think they know a little bit about rings. That's my recommendation. I've been doing it for years and I've never had any issues with ring problems or seating or any of that. We're in the number 7 piston here, so we're going to go in the number 7 hole. Now I'm going to show you again the best ring compressor in the history of the universe. That is the fixed cone. It's a cone, and this one says 4.030 on it, and we have a 30 over bore. So very critical here, before you actually put this on, you want to look at your ring end gap. So there's my end gap from my top ring and second. You want to take those, leave one of them there, and you want to stagger it and put the other one. You don't ever want to line those ring end gaps up because it causes blow by. So stagger the rings on the opposite side of the piston. Take the big side of your cone. We've got the big side of our cone up here, and just very gently work your rings down. You want to get your rings all the way down inside the cone, right? If you've ever used one of those band type ring compressors, once you use these, you'll throw that in the trash. Okay, these are way better. Also want to put a little lube on my bore. I'm in number 7. A little light coating of WD in there. Now, we want to go ahead and remember the notch on the piston goes to the front of the engine up here. So we're very gently, and also it's important that your journal down here is at bottom dead center. So if we look down in that bore there, you can see that my journal is all the way at the bottom of its travel, the furthest point away. Now take your piston and rod assembly, make sure the notch is facing forward, and just very gently put this into the bore. Be careful, you don't want to damage or scratch that bore. We're going to very gently slide it in, and go ahead and get your skirts started in the bore here. It's a snug fit, so you want to get that just right so that those skirts just fall into that bore. Okay, now at that point, I want to make sure that I protect my crankshaft on the other side. You can see that my connecting rod and my rod studs are sticking out here. Now the problem with driving this in here, you need to put some 3/8 fuel line or some little plastic covers on here. I like this thing here. A lot of people sell this. Summit sells it, Powerhouse sells it, Engine Performance Warehouse sells it, which is where I got this one. These just go right over the rod bolts, just like that. Okay, they cover it, and now not only do I have something protecting my rod, my crankshaft here, this is actually going to kind of guide that over the connecting rod. And then we come in here with a soft hammer. Don't use a steel hammer for this. And we just gently tap that into the bore. Once you get in with the rings, and it's as simple as that. It's a great ring compressor. Now we just tap that down until we get over our rod journal here. Now you'll notice we put a generous amount of engine oil. You can use assembly lube here. I like engine oil. But you want to make sure that that journal has a generous amount of assembly lube or engine oil on it before you actually run this down. So we've got that oiled up. Never put the bearing on a dry journal. That's a big no-no. We want plenty of lube here. And then we just gently push our connecting rod and piston assembly down over that crank journal, and then you can remove your journal protector, and we have put this in safely without any damage to our journal or our rod or anything like that. And again, I have got oil on that journal, but I always oil up the bearing side too. Now make sure that your bearing notch here and your number on your rod are on the matching side. Our number on our rod is on the outside here, and here's the number on our cap, and they're both going to go to this side of the rod. Now you'll notice that we did resize these rods. You'll see that there's a machined area here where we cut the caps and we rehoned the bores to make sure the rod bores were round. Resizing the rods after the ARP bolts go in is highly recommended. All right, so we're just going to very gently put our cap on. You want to work your cap on down there. All right, so once the connecting rod is on and torqued up, make sure the rod moves side to side. And then you also want to rotate your engine after you put each one of these in, you guys. And make sure you don't have any binding. Make sure you don't have any hard spots. It should turn nice and smooth with no problems. So you want to make sure you get that right. Any kind of binding problems or anything that you have up here, you're going to have to figure out why that's happening. maybe take the cap off, look at your bearings, but this one feels really good, nice and smooth. We got it torqued up. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of the piston and rod assemblies. I have said this before so many times, but some of you may be new here. If you want to see me install every single piston and rod assembly in this engine, rewind what I just did and watch it 7 more times. It's the same exact thing. So, all right, so I'll get these in and then we'll be back and take a look at our assembled short block. So now before your piston and rod assemblies go in, another critical step here, make sure that you use ARP fastener assembly lube on all these ARP bolts and nuts. That is absolutely critical for the correct torque values. So you can see how we've coated all these with the ARP lube. You want to make sure you get those on every single rod, bolt, and nut before you put these in. ARP has designed their high tensile strength bolts to be used with their special lube in order to get the correct fastener torque. If you don't use it, you're not going to have the right torque here. So don't skip that step if you're using ARP bolts. Another thing I would recommend here, guys, is with ARPs, what I did is I've got all the rods torqued up, but I torqued them and untorqued them 3 times, and that's to make sure I got the right bolt stretch there. The next thing is rod side clearance. So these rods actually have to have movement here. There has to be space between these rods. The spec is about 10 to 20. So we want to make sure we have a minimum of about 10 thousandths. Really all you're worried about this for the most part is that it's not too tight. It's too tight, it can be problematic. So there's an 11 thousandths right there. I'm just going to go ahead and put that in, pull these rods apart, make sure that that goes in there, push them all the way over. Also, you want to make sure that you have movement on the rod. Make sure this rod has movement side to side and this one. Pull them apart. 11 thousandths fits, no problem. Now I'm going to go to 21, see if that goes in. All right, you guys, so there is your short block. Everything went together nice, turned out really good. And again, once you torque everything, rotate the engine, make sure there's no binding or anything like this. It is going to be harder to turn with all those in there, but this feels great. I got no hard spots, no binding. Everything is nice and smooth here. So short block turned out really good. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we got to put the heads on and button this thing up, but I want to look at the I want to put the degree wheel on it and check some of the cam specs. All right, guys, so the first thing we're going to do is check our lift. Now, our lift spec for the intake and exhaust on this cam is both 444 thousandths. We're on 0 now. So I've got a dial bore gauge in there, a lifter bore gauge, and we are on 0, and we're on the base circle. So we're going to go and we're going to count how much lobe lift we have, and then we'll calculate our valve lift. All right, so there we go. There's 50, 100, 200, 260. All right, 270, 276 is where it stops. All right, so now that is lobe lift. You got to remember that you have to figure your rocker arm ratio into this. The rocker arm ratio on the Ford is, we've got 277-ish lift at our lobe. We have a 1.6 rocker ratio. Remember, the rocker arm is a mechanical advantage. It's a fulcrum. Fords have a 1.6 ratio. It's 1 to 6. So if we take 0.277 lobe lift right there, and we multiply that times 1.6, we get 443.2. That's less than 1/1000th away from 444. I would call that 444. So the lift is correct on the exhaust, and I also checked the intake off camera, and it's also 444. So we know that our lift is right, which is good. That's an indicator we got the right cam here. Now, the next things we have to check, we have to set up a degree wheel on here. I am not going to walk you through the whole procedure of degreeing the cam because I've got a bunch of videos where I'm doing that already. If you want a step-by-step instruction tutorial on how to degree a cam, let me know in the comments below and I'll copy and paste the video in there and you can watch that. But we're just going to verify. So far we're good. We verified our lift. Now we're going to verify that our center line is right, which tells us our timing and our duration. But for that, we've got to put a degree wheel on the front of the engine. All right, so another really important check here is deck clearance. Now, I don't anticipate the deck clearance being too much different than stock because this block wasn't decked. So what we do here is we take our bridge gauge and we just bring, now what I did is I zeroed this bridge gauge out on the deck. So the deck is 0 on here. We just put this in the middle of our piston and we come up to the highest point of travel on the piston, and that is going to be our deck clearance there. Okay, so my deck clearance with this piston, now 0, if you look at this indicator here, 0 on my indicator, which is up here, is flush with the deck. And I am, now remember, when the piston goes down in the bore, this gauge is going to move this way off of 0. It's going to go toward the 90 and the 80. And I have about 17. I have 17 thousandths deck clearance. So that piston is 17 thousandths below the deck. Just to make sure the deck is square, we're going to do the same thing on the back. We're going to check the other corner. But sometimes from the factory, these decks will be a little crooked. Not unusual to see that. So we're just going to come up and see what we got in the back. Wow, that's really good. If you see that indicator, that is the highest point of travel on the piston, and I also have 17 thousandths deck clearance here. That's really good factory machining there. That means that the center line of the crank was referenced in decking this, and it's pretty square. It's square decked. Now the next thing we can do is we can calculate our compression ratio based on our deck clearance here. So our gasket thickness is 40 thousandths on our Felpro gasket. Our deck clearance is 17. Our bore is 4.030. We just calculate our bore and our stroke in there and we can figure compression ratio. Alright guys, so I did some quick math here and we know that our deck clearance, we just got 17 thousandths. So our bore on our little Ford here is 4.030. The stroke is 2.870. Our gasket thickness compressed, our Felpro gasket is 40 thousandths. Our deck clearance is 17. Our piston top, it's a flat top, but the valve reliefs account for about 4 cc's of space. The GT40P is about 58 to 60, so we'll say 60 cc's. We take 60 cc's and we add the 4 cc's on the top of the piston, and we get a 64 cc chamber. If I plug all that into the calculator, we get 9-to-1 compression with the GT40P heads, which is good. If you want to know where to go to find a calculator, just do a Google search for RSR compression ratio calculator, and there's a great one on there. You plug all your parameters in and it tells you your compression ratio. You can do this, write it out and do the math if you want, but it just takes way longer. So I like that RSR compression ratio calculator. So we're going to be about 9-to-1. So we're going from 7.8 to 9-to-1. And that is going to make this little motor scream compared to what it did. So, all right, so now let's take a look at, we'll get the degree wheel on there and let's take a look at some of this cam degreeing. All right, guys, so we've got our degree wheel set up. We have found true top dead center, our 0 here. We went through the procedure to find true top dead center here. We've got that taken care of. I'm not going to walk you through that. I've got other videos where we're doing it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check intake lobe center line. We know that our lobe lift is 444, so we're going to go to max lobe lift here to check our center line. So now that we're moving and the indicator's not moving, that means we're on the base circle. Once we start to hit that lobe, you're going to see that lifter. There it goes. So right now we are at the top of the lobe travel. The valve would be opened at its furthest point, which was about 276, 277 right there, and then we just zero the indicator. So I'm at max lobe lift, I'm gonna zero the indicator, and then I'm gonna go backwards down off the lobe 50 thousandths. I'm gonna go backwards down past 50 and then right back to it. And then I'm gonna read my wheel. So if you look at the wheel down here, our pointer is right at 71 degrees. Okay, so we're gonna make a mental note of that, 71 degrees. Now we're gonna go clockwise back up to the top of the lobe travel, and we're gonna keep going until we get right to 50 thousandths off of that lobe center. And we have 162. So we got 71 and 162. We're gonna add those two numbers together. So we've got 71 plus 162 is 233, and then to get your center line you got to divide that. Now remember, we said that our center line was 116 on this cam, so divided by 2, 116.5. That's really close. That's within a half a degree. Anything within a half a degree is considered dead on. So our intake lobe center line, what that tells us is that our cam is timed correctly. It's in there straight up, and it's going to perform like it's supposed to. So that's really good. Now real quickly, we're going to check our duration at 50 thousandths. So to do that, we got to go all the way back down to the base circle. When we get on the base circle of the cam, which is right there, we got to zero it. So we're on the base circle, and we're going to come up off the base circle 50 thousandths and look at our wheel. So we're going to come up off of the base circle 50. Went a little too far there, we'll back it up. Right off of the base circle. And right here what we have is we have 11 degrees right here on this side of top dead center. We got 11 degrees. So we're gonna go all the way up to the top of the lobe travel. There's 100, there's 150, there's 200, there's 250, 277, that's max lobe lift. Now we got to go all the way down, and we got to stop at 50 on the other side of the lobe before the valve closes. So let's go, there's the 77, this is 100, and this is 200. So we're going to stop at 50 before the valve closes right there. If we kept going, the valve would close and go to the base circle right here. And if we look at our wheel, now remember, we're using for duration the black numbers here, not the white ones. So we have about 42 degrees. Now remember, our duration is about 210, something like that on this, at 50. From 50 to 50, from 50 on the opening side of the lobe to 50 on the other side of the lobe, we started out at 11 degrees here, and we went all the way down to bottom dead center, and we went to about 41 degrees over here. So from here to here, we started there and we ended here. So our duration is here. So we from here to here is 41 degrees. From bottom dead center to top dead center up here is 180, but we didn't go 180. We were 11 degrees shy of 180. So our duration is actually, according to this, is 180 minus 11. Minus 11 is 169 plus 41, 210. That's exactly what the cam card says this is. So we have verified that this is the correct cam, and also with intake lobe centerline, it's installed correctly. We're happy with that. That's really good. Now we can take the degree wheel off and continue. Okay guys, so now with your head gaskets, I've talked about this before. With the Ford head gaskets, you really got to be careful here, because if you look at this gasket, the front side of the gasket has no water passages. The back side is open. One side of the gasket has this pattern on it and the other side does not. Regardless of what the pattern is on the gasket, this gasket has to go on, right? And it goes this way. It has to go on with these open holes in the back. Some guys look at this pattern and they're like, oh gosh, it has to go this way because the pattern's up. Well, on the other side of the blank, on the bank over here, it is going to go on with this pattern up because that puts these holes in the back. But if I put this on and I block these holes off in the back of this engine gets no coolant and it will overheat like crazy, like as soon as it warms up. So regardless of what pattern you have on your gaskets, these are Felpros, one side's plain, one side's not. And if you look here, it even says front right there. On both sides, it says front. So remember, the side that says front always goes to the front and the open holes goes in the back. You don't want to get this wrong. This is going to cost you a lot of trouble if you get this wrong. All right, so the next step is to put the cylinder head on. But before we do that, the one thing that you got to take very close note of here is that these roller lifters, because this is a short deck block, and also with your roller lifters, make sure you soak these in oil. It's not for the hydraulic mechanism, it's for this roller down here. So always soak rollers in oil for an hour or two before you install them. You have to put these rollers in before the heads go on. If you don't, you will not get them in. Because of the short deck of the 289-302, once the heads are on, you can't get these retrofit lifters in. So I want to take all my sets of lifters after they've soaked in the oil, go ahead and get those lifters into their respective bores. Okay, and so now that you've got all your roller lifters in, we can go ahead and set the cylinder heads on here. I like to kind of set the engine up here like this. Put your gasket on, make sure the front's closed off, the back is open. And then we're just going to take our cylinder head and set it straight down on these dowel pins. So this is our GT40 cylinder head here. And we're going to go look down at your bolt holes and go straight onto your dowel pins. Now, you don't really want to walk away from this without putting a bolt in it if you can help it. Charlie bought new bolts and I don't actually have them here yet, but I am going to use one of his old bolts just to secure this on here temporarily. And again, we're not using this to torque the head down or anything. We're just putting this in here so the head doesn't actually fall off the engine. Just repeat the same thing for the other side and you'll have both your heads on. And then once we get the bolts, we'll put them in and torque them.